Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a housing association that won't let me drive home. As soon as I arrived at the automated gate, something felt off. Instead of swinging open like it normally did, I had my original access code memorized. I was greeted by a brand new keypad and a high-definition camera pointing at me. Thinking maybe the association had upgraded the security system, I punched in my old code. Nothing happened. I tried the new code they had apparently emailed to residents, but I never got an email. In fact, I'd never even received any letter or call informing me about a gate change. The screen beeped, and I saw a message that said, "Access denied. Great." That was when a voice crackled over the speaker, sounding more than a little impatient. "Name and address?" a woman demanded. I had never heard her voice before, and I felt a surge of annoyance, but I tried to stay calm. "I'm Graham. I live at 107 Sunset." I heard a rapid beeping, and then that same woman cut in sharply. She told me in the most condescending way that there was no listing of me on their records as a resident of this neighborhood, so they could not grant me access. My jaw nearly hit the steering wheel. I'd owned my home here for over 10 years. This new HOA started forming only about 5 years ago, after some developer convinced half the residents we'd be better off governed by a formal committee. I'd ignored the drama around it because my property was fully paid off before they ever came into existence. I had no issues with any neighbor, or so I thought, so I figured I could coexist without much friction. But apparently, that is not how it was going to be. I tried to keep a level head and explained, "Ma'am, I believe there's been a mistake. I've lived here a long time and I never heard anything about changes to the gate." I gave her my home number, the year I purchased it, and some details about the property that only a true resident would know. She seemed uninterested. She repeated that she did not have me on the official list of approved residents and had strict instructions to turn away all unlisted individuals. She even told me that if I continued arguing, she might have to call security to get me off the premises. At that point, I stared in disbelief at the camera. My neighborhood never had official security forces aside from a part-time patrol. I wondered where all this hostility was coming from. I'd never lost my temper in my life the way I almost did that day, but I took a deep breath and placed a phone call to an acquaintance named Sarah, who had moved into the neighborhood about a year ago and had quickly gotten involved in association matters. Sarah was as stunned as I was. She told me she was actually dealing with her own issues. Apparently, the HOA had been stepping up various rules, such as fining people for the type of mailbox they used or the design of their front door. In a hushed tone, she said, "I suspect it has to do with Harriet." I'd heard that name a few times. Harriet was rumored to be the new president of the HOA, a determined woman with a controlling personality who wanted everything run by the letter. I told Sarah about my predicament at the gate, and she was furious on my behalf. She tried to call Harriet directly, but Harriet didn't pick up. Meanwhile, I was still sitting there, causing a minor backup of cars behind me, horns occasionally honking at me to move. Finally, after half an hour of fruitless debate with the gate attendant and a phone call to Sarah that led nowhere, I had no choice but to call the local police. I dialed 911, explaining that I was effectively being locked out of my own property. The dispatcher seemed astonished and asked if I had documents showing proof of ownership. Of course, I had them inside my house, in a file cabinet. When the officer arrived, I had to pull my car to the side of the road near the gate. People behind me had gone around, or in some cases the guard had recognized them, let them in, and refused me. It felt surreal. Here I was, calling 911 just to get into my own neighborhood. The officer seemed just as puzzled as I was. He asked the gate attendant to verify the list, and she repeated the same line about how I wasn't on the official resident record. The officer asked me how long I'd lived there, and I gave him the exact year I'd bought the property, plus the date I'd fully paid off the mortgage. Eventually, the officer decided that enough was enough, and he escorted me to my own driveway, effectively forcing them to open the gate. With his help, I was able to drive in, but not without a stiff glare from the gate attendant. As I entered my home, a swirl of emotions flooded me: anger, confusion, and an overriding sense of betrayal. How was it possible that an HOA that came into existence long after I settled here had the power to deny me access to my own land? At that point, I realized I needed to gather some legal documentation. I rummaged through my files, searching for my original property deed, the settlement paperwork, Anything that might prove definitively that I owned my home free and clear well before the HOA existed. Once I found it, I made photocopies in case I had to hand them over to the board or law enforcement again. The next day, I began making calls. I started with the county records office, verifying that there was no updated version of my deed or any new encumbrances placed on my property. I was assured that everything was in my name, with no mention of mandatory HOA membership. Then I called up the property management company that was rumored to be assisting Harriet. That conversation was aggravating. A representative insisted that they only handled administrative details and were not responsible for how the HOA enforced its rules. That was apparently Harriet's domain. I pressed them, asking them to confirm my name and property address on their official rolls, but they refused to share any membership lists, citing privacy concerns. They recommended that I attend the next board meeting if I had complaints. That's exactly what I decided to do. I marked my calendar for the upcoming Monday evening, where a meeting would be held at the community center. The days leading up to that meeting were tense. I tried to go about my regular routine, work, errands, a bit of yard maintenance, while being mindful that a weird shadow had fallen over everything. Twice that week, I received letters taped to my front door, each bearing the HOA logo, stating that I was in violation of community guidelines. One letter claimed that my car was illegally parked in my own driveway, because apparently the new rules said something about having to keep driveways clear for traffic flow. Another letter alleged that my backyard fence was too tall, even though it was the same fence I'd had for a decade. I felt singled out, targeted by Harriet and her associates. Sarah, my neighbor, told me she also got a notice, but it was about a minor landscaping issue. Her grass was an inch higher than the preferred cut length. She told me that Harriet was apparently on a power trip, trying to impose as many new regulations as possible, hoping to mold the neighborhood into her personal vision of perfection. It was rumored that Harriet had grown up in a strict family and believed wholeheartedly that rules, if enforced to the letter, kept communities in line. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I drove over to the community center. Once again, I faced an issue at the gate, though this time the guard, unfortunately the same woman, reluctantly let me through after verifying that I was on some kind of guest list to attend the meeting. I could barely contain my frustration. I parked and walked into the meeting hall, where about 30 residents were gathered, sitting on folding chairs. At the front of the room, Harriet was seated behind a long table flanked by two other board members, a man named Phil, who looked uncomfortable, and a woman named Tanya, who gave me a polite smile as I settled into a seat near the front. Harriet, on the other hand, wore a tight-lipped expression that showed zero warmth. The meeting started with Harriet welcoming everyone and listing agenda items. She spoke about improvements to the common areas, scheduling pool maintenance, and implementing stricter guidelines for home exteriors. My patience wore thin as I waited for the open forum portion, when residents could ask questions and present issues. Finally, after about 40 minutes of Harriet's monologue and a few minor comments from Phil and Tanya, it was time for public remarks. I shot my hand up so fast I nearly lifted out of my seat. Harriet acknowledged me with a nod, though she didn't call me by name. She simply said, "Yes, you in the front row," as if she didn't know who I was. I introduced myself clearly. "Hello, I'm Graham, homeowner at 107 Sunset." She just stared at me. Then she pulled a notebook closer to her, flipping through pages. I took a breath and said, "I'd like to address a major concern. The new security gate system is not recognizing me as a resident, and I was denied entry to my own home last week. I had to call 911 to gain access. Furthermore, I've received notices about alleged violations, even though I predate the formation of this HOA. I have my deed and original paperwork to prove it." Harriet looked up from her notes and sniffed in a dismissive way. "Our records show that this particular lot was never officially registered under the association's membership," she began. "We have reason to believe there was an oversight by the developer who sold properties before the community guidelines were finalized." She said it as if I was the one who had done something shady. I could feel my blood pressure rising. I told her it was impossible for me to be bound by an organization that did not exist when I purchased my property. She shot back that the community's charter gave the board the right to bring all properties under its umbrella if they fell within certain geographical boundaries. That's when I whipped out the copies of my deed. I had also printed out relevant local statutes. "With all due respect," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "the county clerk's office has confirmed that there is no record of any legal change to my property, that puts me under the HOA's jurisdiction. I was never asked to sign anything, and I never did. I glanced around the room, noticing that some residents looked uneasy, while others seemed intrigued. A few folks in the back, presumably Harriet's supporters, had their arms folded and were glaring at me. Harriet tried to brush me off by suggesting we handle the matter privately, but I insisted on transparency. I want everyone to know what's going on here, because last week I was actually physically kept from my own property, I said. That's a serious issue. It's effectively illegal eviction if you deny someone access to their home. Harriet bristled. She offered no apology, only an icy statement that she'd look into it. When I pressed further, stating that I had already done my own research and found no legal basis for the HOA to forcibly include me or penalize me, Harriet said, "Then you might consider seeking legal counsel." That was it, the final push I needed. I responded, "Thank you for the suggestion, because I already have, and I intend to take action if this continues." She did not respond further, just wrote something in her notes and moved on to the next speaker. My neighbor Sarah quietly gave me a thumbs up from across the row, and a few people even applauded softly as I finished speaking. Harriet scowled at them. I could tell she was not used to being challenged in her domain. Over the next few days, tensions escalated. The guard at the gate was apparently given instructions to not let me in unless Harriet granted permission. However, after my confrontation at the meeting, Harriet must have realized it was a dangerous game to continue blocking me outright because I was able to come and go with only minor delays. But I kept receiving violation notices on my door. One day, I found a particularly nasty note stating that my continued disregard for community standards could result in daily fines. They even threatened to place a lien on my property. I decided it was time to bring in a lawyer. I consulted a real estate attorney named Zachary, who had experience dealing with overreaching HOA boards. Zachary was appalled by the situation. He told me flat out that if the HOA was not included in my deed and I never signed anything acknowledging them, then they had no legal right to impose their rules on me. He suggested we send a cease and desist letter to Harriet and the board, warning them that if they continued to harass me or attempt to fine me, we'd pursue damages. I was reluctant at first, because I'd always been averse to taking neighbors to court, but Harriet had crossed a line. Zachary drafted a stern letter. We included copies of my deed, references to local statutes, and a demand that they remove my address from any mandatory membership rosters. We also requested that they immediately cease attempts to bar me from accessing the gate. Within 3 days, Harriet responded through the property management company's lawyer. The response was as brazen as Harriet herself. It claimed that they had compelling evidence that my home was part of the association's territory. Yet, not once did they produce any actual documentation to back up that claim. They simply repeated their stance and threatened that ignoring the HOA's regulations would lead to further action. Zachary and I weren't going to let them intimidate us. We filed an official complaint with the local government office that oversees homeowner associations. We also filed a police report detailing the incident where I was denied entry and had to call 911. I was told by an officer that what the HOA did was a significant overreach, and though it might not lead to immediate criminal charges, it would strengthen my civil case against them. Meanwhile, Sarah kept me in the loop about Harriet's internal strategies. The board was apparently divided. Harriet had a small circle of supporters who loved her enforcement crusade, while others believed she was going too far. The rumor mill suggested that Harriet had an upcoming re-election, and her hard-nosed tactics had started to fracture her base of support. A few other people in the neighborhood had begun to question the rising costs of HOA fees and the micromanagement of their personal properties. In the midst of all this, a second plot line began to emerge. Phil, the board member who had seemed so uncomfortable during the meeting, reached out to me privately. He asked if we could speak confidentially. We met for coffee one morning and he confided that Harriet had pressured the board into a series of questionable actions. According to Phil, she was furious that certain homes, including mine, were not paying dues to the association. She had set out on a personal mission to bring every lot under the HOA's rule to boost funds and expand her power. Phil was torn, as he wanted to maintain goodwill with Harriet, but also knew that what she was doing was either borderline or outright illegal. He told me Harriet had quietly hired a private security firm for the gate and was instructing them to be as strict as possible. Phil said he felt guilty about the letter of violations I was receiving because Harriet was behind every single one of them. She had singled me out as an example, hoping to scare other residents into compliance. But now that things had escalated so dramatically, Phil was rethinking his position. I was sympathetic. I thanked him for the information and assured him I had no intention of attacking him personally, as I realized Harriet had manipulated the board to suit her will. Nonetheless, I made it clear I wouldn't back down. Phil looked relieved to hear that I understood his predicament. He mentioned that Harriet was planning to call a special meeting to discuss the Graham matter. I raised an eyebrow at how brazen that sounded. Me, a homeowner in good standing, referred to like some troublemaker or threat. Sure enough, a notice went out the following week inviting all members in good standing to a special session to discuss enforcement of community standards. Naturally, I was not on the invite list. However, Sarah handed me a copy of the flyer. It was riddled with language about how the community needed to unite and address ongoing non-compliance by certain parties. It was obvious Harriet was going to use the meeting to stir up sentiment against me, and maybe a few others who had refused to pay dues. At that point, I decided to ramp up my defense, mostly because Harriet's actions were not just about me anymore. They threatened anyone who might resist. Zachary suggested we gather neighbors who were similarly opposed to Harriet's tyranny and form a unified front. We spent a few evenings calling people, telling them the real story behind Harriet's actions. To our surprise, many people in the neighborhood were fed up. They complained about petty fines, late fees, sudden inspections, and a general lack of transparency in how the HOA was spending their money. Some of them were afraid of confronting Harriet, having seen how she treated me, but others were prepared to stand up. On the evening of Harriet's special session, we staged a kind of informational meeting at my house, inviting folks who felt marginalized or abused by the HOA. I had typed up a timeline of all the events that had occurred, from the gate denial to the violation letters to the forced meeting. I also explained how Harriet was trying to trap me under association rules without legal cause. People were appalled. Even some who had initially supported Harriet were alarmed that she was willing to treat a longtime resident this way. I could see the mood shifting from fear to determination. By the end of the night, we agreed that a large group of us would attend the special HOA session, whether we were on the invite list or not, and make our voices heard. The day of Harriet's big showdown arrived. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the community center. I arrived around 6:40 p.m. with about 20 neighbors who backed me up. Phil was there, pacing near the entrance. He shot me a nervous smile and whispered, "Harriet is really on edge." We walked in, and Harriet was seated at a table up front, flanked by Tanya and 2 new board members I hadn't seen before. The property management company's representative was present as well, a stern-looking man in a suit. Harriet blinked in surprise when she saw the large group filing in. She glared at me, and for a moment I thought she would demand we leave. But there were enough folks with legitimate membership in the HOA that we couldn't be easily kicked out. Harriet cleared her throat and started the meeting in her usual dictatorial style. "This session is called to address the growing disregard for community rules. We have a repeat offender, among others, who believes they can simply opt out." She shot me a sideways glance. I stayed quiet for the moment. She continued, "We cannot allow individuals to undermine the integrity of our community. Those who refuse to pay dues or comply with guidelines are subject to penalties, including liens. We have consulted legal counsel, and we intend to pursue all available remedies." I'd had enough. I stood up and said, "And I have consulted my own counsel. You have zero legal standing over me or my property. I was here long before this association existed, and you have yet to provide any document that shows I am bound by your rules." I was shaking with adrenaline, but I kept my voice steady. Harriet stiffened, trying to cut me off, but I pressed on. "You barred me from my home. You threatened me with fines and liens, and you have not produced a single shred of documentation to support your authority. Meanwhile, I have my deed, county records, and statements from neighbors verifying that you've harassed them too." At that moment, Sarah and several other neighbors chimed in, describing their own issues with Harriet's overreach. They mentioned unwarranted inspections, arbitrary fees, and a complete lack of due process. Harriet tried to interrupt each of them, but it was like a small flood of grievances. Even Tanya, who was sitting next to Harriet, looked embarrassed. She quietly said, "Maybe we should hear them out," but Harriet pretended not to hear. Finally, the property management representative cleared his throat and gestured for calm. He said, "I think we need to address these issues systematically. It's clear there is a misunderstanding about membership for certain properties, and we need to clarify that legally." Then he turned to Harriet. "If we are mistaken about Mr. Graham's property being subject to the HOA, we need to rectify that immediately." Harriet stared daggers at him. For a moment, I thought she would explode, but she managed to maintain composure and responded, "I'm confident we're in the right, but we will verify." I stepped forward again, speaking firmly. "You've had months to verify, yet you never approached me in good faith. Instead, you bullied me, locked me out, and threatened me. I've filed complaints with the local authorities. If we have to, we'll see you in court." The tension in the room was thick enough to slice with a knife. Harriet made one last attempt to reassert control. "This is not the time or place for grandstanding. The board will meet in private and make a decision on next steps." With that, she tried to adjourn the meeting, but half the people in the room were furious. Sarah called out, "You can't silence us. We deserve transparency." Harriet ignored her and stood up abruptly, gathering her papers. At that moment, Phil stepped up and said, "I move that we take an immediate vote of no confidence in the current leadership due to allegations of misconduct and potential illegal harassment." You could hear a pin drop. Harriet spun around, looking like she'd been slapped. Tanya seemed surprised, but not necessarily opposed. The property management guy just rubbed his forehead, clearly unprepared for this drama. About 15 people raised their hands in favor of Phil's motion, while Harriet's core supporters did not raise theirs. That moment ended in confusion, because Harriet declared it out of order, but the seeds of rebellion were definitely planted. The crowd started talking all at once, and Harriet stormed out, clearly fuming. Within a week, Harriet's position looked shaky. Tanya and Phil called for a formal recall election, citing Harriet's abuse of power. The official notice went out, and Harriet tried to fight it, but the wave of dissatisfaction was too strong. Meanwhile, my legal action was gaining momentum. I had filed not only the complaint with the Oversight Board, but also a preliminary injunction to prevent Harriet or her proxies from blocking my entry or fining me. Zachary said I had a very strong case and that if Harriet didn't back down, she would face serious financial and legal consequences. Shortly before the recall vote took place, Harriet tried one final gambit. She mailed me a letter claiming that if I agreed to meet with her privately and negotiate some mutual resolution, she would drop the fines and remove any record of violations. I smelled a trap. I wrote back, politely declining, and stated that we should handle all official matters through our respective attorneys. That was the last time I heard directly from Harriet before the recall meeting. The night of the recall vote was even more dramatic than the special session. The turnout was huge, as many neighbors who had been silent before were now emboldened to speak out. Harriet gave a tense opening statement, insisting that she had acted only in the best interests of the community. People murmured in disapproval. Then Phil and Tanya outlined all the ways Harriet had overstepped: unapproved hires, the private security firm, unauthorized fines, intimidation tactics, and attempts to force membership on properties outside the HOA's legal boundaries. They read out statements from various residents, including Sarah, describing the bullying. Finally, they even cited my experience of being locked out of my own home. When it came time for Harriet to respond, she tried to blame a paperwork mix-up for my exclusion and denied instructing the gate staff to deny me entry. But a text message record from the security firm told a different story. Phil produced screenshots that seemed to show Harriet personally directing them to keep me out. The mood in the room turned decidedly against her. By the time the official ballots were cast, Harriet's presidency was done. A large majority voted to remove her from the board entirely. After Harriet's removal, Tanya stepped in as interim president, promising to review all the new rules and hopefully restore some sanity. One of Tanya's first actions was to formally acknowledge that I was not subject to HOA regulations unless I chose to opt in, which of course I did not. She also sent me an apology letter, acknowledging that I was wrongly targeted. I kept a copy for my records. The property management company swiftly updated their access system, ensuring I had a separate code for the gate if I wanted it. To be honest though, I preferred to use my personal gate remote that I'd had since before the HOA existed. They reprogrammed the system so it recognized my remote again. Meanwhile, Harriet retreated into her home. There were rumors she was considering moving out of the neighborhood entirely. I suspected that she might have also faced potential legal issues from other angry residents. Personally, I was just relieved that a sense of normalcy was returning. The citations taped to my door stopped coming. My mailbox was no longer stuffed with threatening letters. I could drive freely into my own driveway. It felt like a victory, not just for me, but for anyone who believes that a person's right to enjoy their home should never be trampled by a power-hungry individual or committee. In the aftermath, several subplots were resolved as well. Sarah and a few of the more moderate residents formed a committee to investigate how HOA funds had been spent under Harriet's leadership. They discovered questionable expenses, such as an overpriced consulting fee for Harriet's personal friend, who supposedly provided aesthetic evaluations. They found bills for decorative items never delivered or installed. None of it rose to the level of criminal fraud, based on the documents they could find. But it certainly cast Harriet in a very negative light and explained why the annual fees had skyrocketed without much to show for it. Phil, the board member, expressed relief that the whole ordeal was over. He admitted he had considered quitting the board earlier but wanted to help from the inside. He apologized to me personally, saying he wished he'd spoken up sooner. I didn't hold a grudge. I recognized he was under pressure. Tanya invited me to community events even though I wasn't an official member, and she tried to mend fences, figuratively speaking. I appreciated the gesture, but I was still cautious about staying out of the association's clutches. I liked living my life with minimal interference, and as far as I was concerned, that's how it would remain. For a while, I was concerned Harriet might try to launch some kind of personal vendetta, but she seemed to have lost all her influence and quietly faded away. A for sale sign eventually appeared in front of her house, and a few months later, she was gone. From what I heard, the neighbors who stayed behind were relieved. With Harriet out of the picture, the board found a healthier balance between maintaining the look of the neighborhood and respecting individual property rights. New guidelines were instituted, with input from homeowners, and the entire environment became much more cordial. I would be lying if I said the experience didn't leave me somewhat bitter. For a long time, I had taken my property rights for granted. I assumed that people would respect the fact that I'd lived here longer than most. Yet, Harriet's stunt forced me to realize how easily an overzealous individual could try to twist the rules and encroach on someone's life. It also taught me the importance of standing up for myself. In the end, though, I consider it a lesson in community advocacy as well. By standing together with neighbors, we were able to put a stop to Harriet's nonsense and bring accountability to the board. Some months later, I received an update that local authorities had dismissed Harriet's claim to place a lien on my property, as no legal basis existed. Zachary, my attorney, congratulated me on having the foresight to file those complaints and keep detailed records. He pointed out that if I hadn't documented everything, the gate denial, the violation notices, the attempts at fines, Harriet might have been able to spin a different story. It reminded me that the paper trail can be one's best friend in these disputes. Friends, thank you. See you soon.